Listening to the Weekly Brew.
One of the big stories in college basketball this season has to be the job that head coach Billy Kennedy has done, leading the Aggies to the SEC regular season championship and their first conference title since their days in the Southwest Conference back in the 1980s. Perhaps more impressively is that they did it against a Kentucky team that was picked by most to run away with the league this season. Now joining us on the Weekly Brew to discuss the Aggies' postseason prospects is Brent Zwerneman, who covers Texas A&M for the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. Brent, how are you doing this week?
Good. How are you doing?
Hey, not bad. We're definitely looking forward to March Madness approaching. I know we're all huge college basketball fans, but I guess before we get started, there were a lot of rumors circulating this offseason and, the past few years that Coach Kennedy's days at Texas A&M might be on thin ice, kind of numbered. Obviously, he silenced his critics this season. What is the biggest reason this year behind Aggie's success?
It was one of those deals where A&M hadn't had a whole lot of basketball success dating back to the late 1980s into the early 1990s and on through the 1990s, really. And then Billy Gillespie came along. They hired him from UTEP in 2004, I think, right around in there. And next thing you know, by 2006, they're in the NCAA tournament. And they had 6 straight appearances, 2 under Gillespie, then 4 more under Mark Turgeon, now the head coach at Maryland. So Aggies got used to kind of playing in the NCAA tournament and that being a part of the spring schedule, when they're looking around for things to do A&M related. Well, Billy Kennedy arrived, and there were some things. There were some extenuating circumstances, and he didn't inherit a whole lot actually at that point. Next thing you know, they missed the tournament from 2012 till last year. And so at that point, Aggies are saying, okay, Billy Kennedy is a nice guy and he's a good role model for the players, but bottom line is you need to be a part of the 68-team field. They barely missed it last year. Danuel House got hurt late in the season, and they dropped a few games that maybe they shouldn't have, and next thing you know, and even on Selection Sunday, they thought that there was an outside chance they might get in. So they were really close last year. And so this year, you knew at that point, Billy Kennedy, after they lost in the NIT, he told us, and I thought it was different for him. His personality is not this, but he said, I guarantee you we will be in the NCAA tournament next season. And the reason he was so confident is the way it played out. A&M had one of the top recruiting classes in the nation last year with guys like Tyler Davis, Edmond Gilder, DJ Hogue. I mean, some guys who had grown used to winning in high school, were winning state championships. And you combine those with some seniors, some really talented seniors, guys like House that I mentioned, Jalen Jones, Alex Caruso, and then this point guard who transferred in from South Florida, Anthony Collins, who was able to play right away because he had already graduated from South Florida, who had NCAA tournament experience. So you combine all those guys and you say, okay, this program might really be onto something now. And sure enough, I mean, they start out 7-0 in SEC play, had a 2-game lead, and lost a really close game at Arkansas. Next thing you know, they hit a dip, and they lose 5 in a row at that point, and people are saying, okay, this team might not even make the tournament again. But those seniors kind of came together. They led the freshmen by the hand. The freshmen came on strong late in the season. Next thing you know, they close out the regular season with 6 straight wins, and they win their first regular season conference title in 30 years, which is incredible that it's been that long for something like that. But, they partied hard on the court last night at Reed Arena or yesterday afternoon and cut down the nets and all those things. But Billy Kennedy also reminded us, hey, the thing is, everyone remembers teams by how they perform in the NCAA tournament, not so much how they win conference titles and so forth, because basketball is just such a different deal, obviously, than football. So anyway, so that's where they are right now. And this is a team, I said all along, maybe early in the season, I said this is a Sweet 16 team at minimum. And I said, and who knows, wouldn't that be something if the Aggies ended up in the Final Four in NRG Stadium? I mean, that would be crazy. The Houston would be drunk with Aggies, more drunk with Aggies than it already is, in terms of, having the largest alumni base in the nation for Texas A&M former students. So that would be something, but obviously they have a long way to go there. But I will tell you this, they have the elements to do it with that combination of savvy seniors and really talented freshmen. So we'll see what happens from here.
I think it's interesting you allude to the difference between the football and the basketball programs, because the SEC has proved to be kind of a crucible that has been too much for the football team, but they've really excelled in basketball. So, I mean, just from a global perspective, how competitive is the SEC in terms of basketball, and what does it mean that the Aggies are at the top of that?
It's a top-heavy league. I mean, if you look at some championships, over the past decade. Obviously, Kentucky is a perennial powerhouse. Always has been one of those handful of teams that you point at and say Kentucky, Kansas, Duke, those type of programs that are just flat basketball schools. So you have them in the SEC, and then Florida under Billy Donovan had those runs where they won a couple of titles, and so that was neat for the Gators and neat for the SEC. But yes, it is a top-heavy league. I mean, I got used to covering the Aggies in the Big 12, and I got in on the tail end of the Southwest Conference 20 years ago. And there was an okay basketball league. Obviously, sometimes Texas could really be up and so forth, and so could the Aggies. And Tech was pretty good along the way there in the mid-'90s. But the Big 12 was something else altogether. I mean, they love basketball in the Big 12. They have Oklahoma State, obviously Kansas that I mentioned. I mean, these guys up in the colder states up Midwest, I mean, basketball's a bigger deal up there because it's played more year-round because that nasty weather can keep them indoors more. So the Big 12 was a tough league, and especially Kansas leading the way there. So when the Aggies went into the SEC, the thought was, okay, this is one area where the basketball team will have it a little better. Well, going back to what I said at the beginning, they still didn't make the NCAA tournament, and they had kind of struggled, going back to your first observation that Billy Kennedy was kind of on the hot seat as of about 2 years ago. And but again, the idea that you can share a league title with Kentucky, but not just share it with them. They actually, the Aggies own the top seed, so they're really in the standings. You're going to see Texas A&M first because they beat Kentucky this season. So that's really a feather in this team's cap as well. The game was in Reed Arena. If it had been in Lexington, Kentucky, the outcome might have been different, but they were fortunate this year that the Wildcats were here in College Station. So yeah, the SEC is certainly a top-heavy league, but anytime you have to contend with the Kentucky Wildcats, that's going to make it tough right there, and the Aggies more than held their own this year.
As a U of H alum, and I cover U of H as well, is Danuel House, who was part of that diaspora when James Dickey left and Kelvin Sampson took over. Tayshaun Thomas going to Oklahoma, and House went to A&M, and he's been very successful there. So, I mean, just from your standpoint, watching the team day in, day out, how key a component has he been, and what are we missing here in Houston now that he's playing for A&M?
You knew right away, obviously, when House transferred. I mean, he's been a talent. Everyone knew that from back in his Hightower days, that he was an extremely talented guy. And it's funny, I've had two different people who didn't really know Daniel's background this year say, "Man, that guy that he looks a lot like Carl Lewis." And I kind of laughed. I said, "You know what? He does look a lot like Carl Lewis." And these folks didn't even realize Daniel's U of H background, so I thought that was kind of a neat little add to the whole deal. But he's been a lot of fun to cover. Good guy to cover. He has a little daughter that he brought to the Meet the Aggies Day back preseason, and when we were on the court yesterday, kind of watching these guys celebrate, Danuel was just flat out crying. Tears were running down his cheeks, and he was holding his teammates and kind of clutching this SEC deal. It wasn't really a trophy or anything. It was kind of this, I don't know what you'd call it, a cardboard cutout of the SEC teams, or I'm not sure what it was, but he was clutching that. And you could tell how much it meant to him. Now, we'll say this. He has benefited greatly from a fellow senior transfer in Jalen Jones. Those guys are they're built pretty similarly, but Jalen will play more inside. He can play inside, outside, whereas Daniel's, mainly an outside guy. So those two guys really complemented each other, and they actually, kind of have similar backgrounds. Jalen started out at SMU, Danuel at U of H, and they came together, and now they're leading this team in the NCAA tournament. But from a personal perspective, Daniel's been a whole lot of fun to cover, and always been helpful, and always been kind of funny and insightful in his interviews as well, which, of course, as reporters, we love that part of it too.
Now, one of the things that kind of strikes me as a little bit rare for the Texas A&M basketball team this year is that they have 4 seniors in the starting lineup. And again, you had mentioned, Jalen Jones transferring from SMU, House again coming from Houston, Anthony Collins, the graduate transfer from USF. The guy that sticks out to me is Alex Caruso. I mean, A&M Consol, local product there for College Station. You wrote an article this past week talking about, he took his first dribble on the court at Reed Arena when he was at the age of 4. What has it meant for the program to have a guy like Caruso be such a productive player, averaging, nearly 8 points a game, 5 assists, and having, the A&M all-time career leader in steals? He's
a guy I've watched, obviously, since high school, and I've known his dad for 20 years, Mike Caruso, who's an associate AD at A&M. Just a really good guy, and Mike Caruso, was a pretty good basketball player at Creighton under Eddie Sutton at that time, back in the late 60s, early 70s. So Alex had a basketball background, but when he signed with A&M, I can remember some Aggies and even some outsiders say, oh, well, they're just doing this kid a favor because his dad works in the A&M athletics department and he's a local guy and all those. So Alex had to kind of deal with that a little bit. But I knew from having seen him in high school, I said, he's real and he's legitimate and he can play the college game at this level. And it's one of those things where he hasn't quite gotten the notoriety that maybe some of his predecessors that with the Aggies had, because they did go to the NCAA tournament and he's missed out on it his first 3 years. So you talk about a guy who's really paid his dues, and as a senior is now going into the tournament with, like I said, what I think is a minimum Sweet 16 team. So it really all came together. And again, I put in that article that you mentioned that he and Reed Arena grew up together, because Alex was born in 1994. Reed Arena opened in 1998. So his dad would take him out there and he'd dribble the ball around. He couldn't even make a basket at that point because he couldn't heave the ball that high up 10 feet. So you talk about a neat story and a neat local story. And not only that, Alex has been so steady through the years. He's now the school's all-time assist and steals leader. And that's really saying something. It's one thing to be the leader in one category and so forth after starting most of your career over 4 years, but to have two categories like that is really cool. And a lot of us have seen him kind of grow up before our eyes. Are really happy for the Caruso family, kind of the way it's turned out this season. I saw his dad yesterday and mother on the court, and of course their eyes were very wet, just kind of taking it all in. And it was really a neat scene to see the Carusos all together enjoying that time.
Brent, just kind of looking at A&M's whole season, they had some really huge wins this year against Gonzaga, Texas, Baylor, Iowa State, Kentucky. Tell us, what kind of momentum does that create going into March here in the tournament?
Yeah, if there are criticisms of the SEC overall, the Aggies kind of answered those with what you just said by going, was it 4-0 against Big 12 opponents? They beat Texas, Iowa State, Baylor, Kansas State. So that was neat for, and of course Aggies were joking that they're the Big 12 champions, and others would remind them, well, you didn't play Kansas in that group, but certainly a boost to their overall schedule was to do that, and it was also kind of a source of pride for A&M, for A&M fans who had seen the transition from the Big 12 and the critics who had said, the Aggies are not going to have success in this new league, and why would they ever do this and move on. So it was neat from that perspective, from an A&M fan's perspective, that they would do so well against some ranked teams, talking about Iowa State and Baylor in particular. So, and I think every one of those games was a double-digit victory, if I'm not mistaken. So that was a neat deal from A&M's end, in that they were able to kind of do that against some of their old former foes, and to have Texas back on the schedule. I mean, it's a shame a little bit that they finally play the Longhorns again, and it's on an island, out in the Bahamas, where a bunch of Aggies and Longhorns can't go to it to enjoy that. But maybe that's a good start in these teams maybe playing in the future as they move forward. So yeah, definitely a bolster for those who say, oh, the SEC just really isn't that tough anyway, outside of your Kentuckys and so forth. The fact that they did so well out of conferences is going to really help this team with its seeding, which you're probably looking at a 4 or 5 seeding right now for the Aggies in the NCAA tournament. And maybe some of that has to do with how they do this week in Nashville at the SEC tournament, which I'm heading out for on Thursday, which it's a neat setting. It's one of those things there in Nashville, which is such a great town anyway, but Kentucky fans just swarm that place, as you can imagine. It's just a sea of blue, and I'm talking about out in the streets out there too, where all the clubs and bars are and everything, in such a festive atmosphere. Well, I'm expecting to at least see a little more maroon this year, based on the Aggies' success. And as y'all know, there are Aggies everywhere. I mean, they're all over the nation.
That's true.
So they do tend to, in something like this, I would imagine you're going to see more A&M fans than you've seen, in 20 years, because the Big 12 tournament was typically in Kansas City, and A&M always didn't have the most success in that league as well until Gillespie came along. So I would suspect this is going to be a little different now in terms of A&M fans kind of responding and going and seeing their favorite team play in Nashville this season.
Now, kind of speaking of Nashville and everything that's going to go on Broadway Street that week, A&M plays, as you mentioned, on Friday. They're either going to play Arkansas or they're going to play Florida. A&M pounded Arkansas on January 2nd, 92-69. Kind of squeaked out a win on January 12th against Florida, 71-68. Both of those were home games. Do you think playing on a neutral environment is going to kind of impact how A&M prepares for this game, and how do you see A&M matching up with either one of these teams?
Yeah, if you look at their schedule, most of their losses, I think they just had the one home loss to South Carolina, and that was a really close game, 81-78. So, they did go up to Arkansas, and that's when that losing streak started. It was a really close game, 74-71. They lose to the Razorbacks. So certainly there's some legitimacy to the idea that Reed Arena did offer a home court advantage, going back to a guy like Alex Caruso, who's been on Reed Arena on that court all his life. Yeah, it did kind of provided A&M a pretty heavy home court advantage, and they really struggled. If you look at those losses, they lost at Vanderbilt, at Arkansas, at Alabama, at LSU, in that stretch. So yeah, there is something to the idea that playing so far away and playing against, playing really in the heart of the SEC up there is it makes it more difficult. And I will say this about A&M and the SEC, being the as I say, the westernmost outpost. They don't have a lot of the league championships much in proximity to College Station or Southeast Texas. And if you'd have said, okay, it's in New Orleans, that would be a different story. That would be as close as you're going to get something like that. But right now, they've played these championships pretty far from College Station, so certainly that helps some of these other teams that are much closer geographically in terms of their fan turnout and so forth. So, whether they get Florida or Arkansas, I really expect a good game, because those games were all fairly close. Well, I guess that one against Arkansas to start out with wasn't close, but after that, those other two games, Florida and then at Arkansas, were pretty tight. So, yeah, I would expect a good game either way. And that game is at noon on Friday for those interested in it as well.
Being a Houston podcast, we're obviously very excited about having the Final Four here in Houston. I'll be covering that for HCN, and I'm looking very much forward to it. Just, kind of taking a wider look at the college basketball landscape. Who do you think are the teams most likely to be there? Is A&M among them? And then who's been the best player this year in college basketball, according to what you've seen?
It's so wide open this year from what you've seen throughout the season. I mean, it's been one of those seasons where you say, man, there truly could be any number of teams that could be left standing in Houston. And I will say this from the Aggies' perspective, that is a nugget for them. The pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, really, with the idea that they could go on this incredible journey in the NCAA tournament and end up 100 miles from Reed Arena there at NRG Stadium. And you got to say, overall, Buddy Hield, right, from OU, I mean, is there any argument there in terms of player of the year? Y'all have any better ideas?
I can't think of any. I mean, that's the consensus pick that we've heard.
No one from the SEC, which is kind of my discipline, of course, in terms of watching. But I think he's probably the best player, and really, I'm not sure that there's a close second at this point.
Maybe you throw in Valentine from Michigan State. I mean, he's had a great year, senior, probable lottery pick. But other than that, I think Buddy Hield's probably the odds-on favorite. Interestingly enough, the other two guests that we've had on the show have both said the same thing. So you're right on par with them.
One of those things where, OU had the late kind of drop, and so forth, where his numbers declined and they had some losses and everything. But I think he was still so far out front that he was still going to be the guy at that point. And, you'd like to throw in a guy like Ben Simmons in there, a true freshman and just a remarkable player, and a guy who I watched up close and did a feature story on. The Chronicle actually sent me to Baton Rouge to sit down with him, and he's just a neat kid. The bottom line is you're talking about an LSU program that was really disappointing this season, so you can't really factor him in the mix, because to me, if you're going to be player of the year, your team better reflect that as well, and certainly the Tigers have not. So yeah, I think you've got to go Hield with the player of the year.
And definitely looking forward to March Madness, and looking forward to see how the Aggies can do, because I know if the Aggies are here in the Final Four, the city of Houston's going to absolutely turn out and support them. So it would be great for the community and hosting the Final Four here at NRG Stadium. But Brent, we definitely appreciate you taking the time out and joining us on the Weekly Brew this week. And for those that are interested in following your work, not only leading up to the SEC tournament and March Madness, but just for Aggies in general, where can they find you online?
Probably the best way, I link everything on Twitter, so it's at Brent Zwerneman, BrentZwerneman, and that's the best way. Or of course, Chron.com or HoustonChronicle.com, and then search Aggies at that point. But yeah, I'll be in on the NCAA tournament regardless of how A&M ends up doing, because it's such a big deal for our city, to host the Final Four. So certainly looking forward to that, and always, this is one of my favorite times of the year, obviously, just because it's warming up, the weather's nice, and you just get to watch a whole lot of college basketball, which is really cool. So I appreciate y'all having me on, and we'll catch up down the road.
Absolutely, Brent. We appreciate it. Enjoy your trip in Nashville this week.
Okay, sure will. We'll see y'all.